Okay, we're live. Welcome, everyone, to our microbiome webinar, the Total Gut Restoration. My name is Joe Rignola, one of the producers of the Human Longevity Project. I'm here with our resident microbiologist, Kiran Krishnan, and, of course, Jason Paul, the co-founder and host of the Human Longevity Project. What's up, guys?
Hey, Joe. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Yeah, I'm feeling the energy from your lamp behind me.
I do. I've got three of them. I've got one here. I've got two back there. It's good. It's all good. Like crystals laying around.
I like it.
Good.
It's better than the studio background you used to have back there. Now the energetics are beautiful.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah, well, it's good to have Kiran on. For those who watch the series, Kiran played a huge role in exposing and detailing out a lot of what the microbiota do with regard to the immune system, brain function, metabolic function, communication to the mitochondria, so many things that the microbiota do. And as a practitioner working with a lot of people that have chronic disease, this is a key focal point for anything that we had to do to restore health. And in fact, one of the things that I would often do, become close with Kiran, partially because he had so much information, and this was a key source for me to learn what's new. Because let's face it, this stuff is coming out so fast. The research, the science, the modified understandings. What we thought we knew 2 years ago is now shifting. It's all moving so fast, and so Kiran is one of those sources that I have, and honestly, most of us in the integrative and functional medicine community rely on to give us the latest and greatest in the science and what they're discovering with their products. So they're, Microbiome Labs and Kiran and his team are really leading the way in when it comes to the gut function. So that's why we brought him on. We're actually going to be kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit on a presentation that he gives to clinicians. He's kind of the guy that really trains a lot of the clinicians in this space. And he's going to give you guys the same presentation that he gives to the leading functional medicine doctors in the gut health space around the world, not just the US. This is in Europe, in Asia. This is what he does, his lecture on this stuff. And we knew we could bring this to our audience because we have an insanely smart audience that has followed our series, that was able to keep up, and you guys are the ones that are here. So we wanted to give you guys the foremost, the cutting edge research and development in terms of how to use certain products to assist with your chronic disease or even just improving health. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have Kiran go through that, and then after that we'll actually go over some lifestyle aspects and tips to assist the products that he's going to be talking about and to restore gut function. So with that, Kiran, thank you for joining us. As always, I appreciate you always giving me this lecture, because I continue to learn and relearn and remember a lot of the things that you've said before and others have said. So thank you so much, and we'll just turn it over to you.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure, Jason. Thank you, Joe, as well. So this is the lecture I've been giving over the last close to 8-10 months at most of the conferences I've been invited to speak in. And what a lot of the functional medicine docs say is that when they understand the impact of the microbiome in terms of chronic illness from this perspective, as they'll see in the talk, it really puts it in, it puts them in the driver's seat as far as how to address the complexities of the microbiome with respect to clinical disease. And this particular talk has actually spawned 2 or 3 new big clinical trials. One of them is at the Mitchell Cancer Institute with Arthur Frankel, who's one of the leading melanoma researchers. We're now doing a study with him based on this talk and an understanding of the impact of this microbiome on immune system function and all that, as he's one of the leaders in immunotherapy in melanoma. So there's been a few clinical trials that have spawned from this. It's really an overall insight on how the microbiome impacts disease. So let's jump right into it, and then I will explain things as we go along. So this talk is called Total Gut Restoration, and really the idea behind this came from the last 6 years working with practitioners like Jason and Joe and many of the functional doctors that we work with. The biggest question they always had is, how do we figure out what's wrong with the gut and how do we approach it? right? So imagine, and you guys are listening to this from the patient perspective, but imagine from your doctor's perspective, the first morning patient comes in and they're struggling with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So they've got this autoimmune condition. It's messing up their hormones. It's causing all types of havoc in the body. The second patient that comes in has scleroderma, or has some skin type of issue. And then the third patient that comes in is dealing with metabolic distress. So they're overweight and they've got diabetes and they're dealing with blood sugar control issues. Now, as a functional medicine doctor, you know that every one of those patients has a gut component to their condition. But the question is, their diseases are so vastly different. How do you figure out what is wrong with each of their guts? And thereby, how do you go about treating it? And as it turns out, when you dig into the research available through the Human Microbiome Project and all of the other microbiome research has spawned since then, you really come to understand that there are certain common dysfunctions in all of these diseases. So the big premise of this talk is to really understand what those common dysfunctions are. And you'll notice that those common dysfunctions are very prevalent in the standard American gut, the SAG, as I call it. A lot of it is due to the standard American diet. So the SAD drives the SAG, and the SAG harbors a lot of these characteristics. And you'll see through the research I show you the variety of conditions that are affected by the same root cause. And in fact, many of the studies I'll show you are review papers, and I'll explain what that means. And then finally, how do we fix those fundamental dysfunctions within the microbiome? How do we go about reversing those dysfunctions systematically in a stepwise manner so that we can totally restore gut function, which then restores bodily function? So let's start with the understanding of where the ground zero of all of these battles are occurring, and it's occurring in the intestinal epithelium, or the gut lining, if you will. Now, this epithelium is also similar to the blood-brain barrier, your mucosal lining in your upper respiratory tract, your urogenital lining. So this is reflective of all of these common surfaces in your body as well. So, but we're going to focus on the gut because that's kind of the command center of where things kind of go wrong. So if you look on this left-hand side, you'll see these two layers to the mucus. And these are very distinct layers. The upper part of the mucus is a more liquid-like layer. The inner part is a more rigid structure called mucin 2. And in fact, this inner layer of the mucus is supposed to act as a barrier against microbes and toxins and pathogens all passing through, including your commensal bacteria. So all of your commensal bacteria are supposed to exist in this top layer. If they're allowed to start migrating more to the inner layer, it's going to cause a dysfunction in this whole mucosal system and inflammation in this whole mucosal system. So this is what it's supposed to look like in a healthy condition. Little to no inflammation at the intestinal lining, little to no inflammation in this inner part of the mucosa. All of the byproducts and the microbes themselves are existing in this top layer of the mucosa. And then this conduit, this darker blue layer, acts as a conduit for communication between the intestinal, the bacteria that sits in the top layer, and the intestinal epithelial cells. Within the intestinal epithelial cells, there's a number of immune type cells called M cells, L cells, your goblet cells. They all act as kind of a de facto part of your immune system. The communication between the microbes and those immune cells are critically important for maintaining homeostasis, and for maintaining homeostasis in how you react to the world around you, to the foods that are coming in, to the microbes that are coming in, to the toxins that are coming in. All of the things that you're exposed to are dictated, your body's ability to react to them are dictated by this crosstalk between the microbes up here and the intestinal epithelial cells and all the immune cells that exist in this bottom layer. So the maintenance of this structure is really important to maintain that crosstalk. Now, when your gut is dysfunctional or leaky, it starts with the very first dysfunction that occurs called dysbiosis. So dysbiosis, many of you are familiar with the term. If you're not familiar with the term, it basically just means an imbalance of the healthy microbes within the gut. Now, dysbiosis is also complicated in that everybody has a different microbiome. if you took any two humans and tested them, at best, they would be about 50% similar in their microbiome. And so with our microbiomes all being so different, how do we identify what is a dysbiotic microbiome versus a healthy microbiome? Well, as it turns out, if you look at a decade's worth of microbiome research, there are certain characteristics of a dysbiotic microbiome that tend to hold true throughout every disease pathology. The first one is low levels of keystone strains. So there are certain strains within the microbiome that are determined to be keystone strains because they're pinnacle to the function of the microbiome. They hold up the rest of the microbiome, and in fact, they themselves are incredibly protective to the human subject, so to us. Some of these keystone strains protect us against dozens and dozens of chronic illnesses, and I'll talk about some of those in upcoming slides. But some of the most well-known keystone strains are Akkermansia. So having low levels of Akkermansia, Muciniphila are characteristic of having dysbiosis. Faecalibacteria prausnitzii, that's another really important keystone strain. Having low levels of Faecalibacteria are characteristic of dysbiosis. Bifidobacterium longum is another very important keystone strain. Bifidobacterium adolescentes, that's another example of an important keystone strain. Again, having low levels of those bacteria are characteristic of a dysbiotic microbiota. Now, the other aspect of a dysfunctional microbiota is low diversity. Diversity in the microbiome is paramount to health. There are studies, I'll show you one, that even that show that even the diversity of your microbiome dictates your longevity. So how long you live and how healthy your life is determined in large part by the diversity in your microbiome. Diversity in the microbiome gives you resistance to infection, gives you resistance to immune dysfunctions, gives you protection against metabolic dysfunctions, age-related disorders, mitochondrial dysfunction. So all of these things that go wrong in the body are protected against when you have significant diversity in the microbiome. Even things like hormone imbalances. So estrogen dominance is a factor of low diversity within the microbiome. So we'll show some of those studies as well that show you all of the variety of conditions that are driven by low diversity in the microbiome. So these are the two important features. Low keystone strains and low diversity are the hallmarks of a dysbiotic microbiome. Now, when you have low diversity and low keystone strains, you also get low levels of postbiotics. Now, postbiotics are compounds that are produced by the microbiota that are essential to human function and human health. So some of the most well-known are short-chain fatty acids. So butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Then there are branched-chain fatty acids. And in fact, there are thousands, literally thousands of compounds and proteins that are produced by the microbiome that are essential to human health and human function. And those are called postbiotics. When we have low diversity and low keystone strains, we tend to have low levels of production of these critical postbiotics. The ones we focus on a lot are short-chain fatty acids because they are absolutely essential and they're universal within the body, meaning they are used in the microbiome. They're also used in other parts of the body, even the brain, the liver, the pancreas, and all of the peripheral immune cells all use short-chain fatty acids. They also happen to be the primary food for the enterocytes, so the cells that make up your intestinal lining. That's the primary fuel for them. So in order for your intestinal lining to even exist in the proper manner, it requires the production of short-chain fatty acids. So low levels of short-chain fatty acids are characteristic among several chronic conditions that people tend to suffer from, and you can measure the risk of chronic of that particular chronic condition based on the amount of short-chain fatty acids being produced. One of those is colorectal cancer, or certainly IBD, so Crohn's and colitis. Both of those conditions, including the third one, colorectal cancer, are characterized by the amount of short-chain fatty acids being produced in the gut. So that's a really important hallmark of a healthy gut. Now, when you get low levels of short-chain fatty acids, you also start getting a dismantling of this really important mucus layer that we talked about earlier. And as you dismantle this inner part of the mucus layer, you start getting some of your commensal bacteria migrating or translocating to the inner part of the mucus layer. The moment you get a higher amount of translocation of even your commensal bacteria into this inner part of the mucus layer, you start getting a disrupted mucosal structure and a disrupted mucosal immune response. Because what happens is bacteria will start moving into the inner part of the mucus, and some of those bacteria have enzymes to break down the inner part of the mucus. So you start actually losing the barrier structure of the mucus, and as you start losing the barrier structure of the mucus, the immune cells that sit in this area start to freak out because they're seeing too many microbes entering this inner sanctity. And as they see too many microbes entering that inner sanctity, they are recruited to bring in inflammatory immune responses to this inner part of the mucosa. That's considered a disrupted mucosal immune response. Because remember, this mucosal system here is the conduit for the communication between your microbiome and your immune system. And that's where all of the adaptation and tolerance is built. When your immune system sees food particles or environmental components like ragweed and pollen, all of that entering the mucosal system, if all of this system is, these structures are in place, your immune system is allowed to build adaptations and tolerance to those things so it doesn't attack it all the time. But when your immune system is inundated with a heavy level of translocation of bacteria, viruses, and other components into this inner sanctity, it has no choice but to react in an inflammatory manner to everything that's coming in and everything it sees. That leads to food intolerances, allergies, asthma, and significant chronic inflammatory response throughout the body. Now, this, as we are illustrating it, is happening in the gut, right? And the gut, it's important to note, is the command center for all other mucosal tissue in the body. So in your upper respiratory tract, in your urogenital tract, even in the areas in your brain and in your skin. So your skin, beyond the epidermal layer up top, there's a mucosal layer, and how your skin responds to the environment around you is dictated by what's going on in the command center, which is the gut mucosa. So if there is inflammation and a significant amount of distress going on in the gut mucosa, that will be translated to your upper respiratory tract mucosa, your skin mucosa, your urogenital mucosa. That can lead to things like chronic sinus infections, chronic bacterial vaginosis, chronic skin infections. So all of these issues stem from this gut command center. Now, when you have this chronic immune reaction in the inner part of your mucosa, you start to damage these intestinal cells and the tight junctions in between them, and you get a dysfunctional gut barrier. When the gut barrier is dysfunctional, then things are allowed to leak through in between the cells and even through the cells on a regular basis and enter the circulatory system. So down here, this area is called the basolateral layer, or the lamina propria. This is where you get access to the circulatory system. So stuff that is supposed to be maintained up here, like these endotoxins called LPS, viral particles, bacterial particles, food particles, are now allowed to leak through indiscriminately into the circulatory system. That activates a significant amount of inflammation both here locally at the site of the leak, but also this particular type of inflammation, because it starts with or it leads to interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and interleukin-1 beta, also gets expressed systemically, and this is the major source of chronic systemic inflammation. So this is what's going wrong in the standard American gut. And again, this is a process, so there's a flow to this. It starts with dysbiosis, with the low keystone strains and low diversity. Once you establish these two issues, then the cascade of this disrupted mucosa, disrupted mucosal immune response, and finally disrupted gut barrier happens in sequence. And then ultimately you end up with too much LPS and other toxins leaking through indiscriminately on a regular basis as you're walking, talking, breathing, and functioning as a human. As you get too much influx of all this stuff, you're setting up your body for that chronic inflammatory response, that chronic low-grade inflammation that drives most chronic diseases that we see. So now let me show you some evidence how these basic dysfunctions are the biggest drivers of most of the chronic illnesses that we look at. So most of these papers I'll show you are what we call review papers, and they're really important to look at because remember, science doesn't happen with just a single publication. You know, a single publication doesn't prove all that much. What you need is supportive science that offers a consortium and a consensus on the mechanisms and the knowledge surrounding that particular topic. So these review papers are really useful because what they do is experts in the field will go through and they will review hundreds, in some cases dozens, in other cases hundreds, depending on the topic, of studies that have been published on that particular topic, and they'll come up with a scientific consensus on what all of these studies are saying. So what we're going to show you is mostly review papers, because what we're showing you is this evidence is consensual among most of the leading researchers in this space. So this is a study on the benefits of modulation of the gut microbiota. This is the dysbiosis. They define in this paper the dysbiosis that we talked about, the low levels of keystone strains, low diversity within the microbiome. They basically conclude that the disruption of the gut microbiota has been implicated in many conditions and diseases, including obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer. If you look at these conditions, many of them are seemingly unrelated. You know, many people would not relate irritable bowel syndrome to type 2 diabetes or colorectal cancer to obesity, but they are related in the sense that they all have the same kind of origin, and that's a disruption of the gut microbiota. They also talk about how as we gain a deeper understanding of the specific relationship between the gut microbiota and disease, they talk about the potential therapeutic target of intelligent modulation of the intestinal community and how this could be extremely beneficial for human health. So now that we understand that there are certain characteristics of a dysbiotic microbiome that leads to all of these types of chronic conditions, if we can modulate the microbiome and fix that dysbiosis, what they call intelligent modulation, this could be extremely beneficial for human health because we might be able to control or reverse or treat many of these conditions just by changing the microbiome. So that's a really important point to put across because that supports a lot of what we just talked about the standard American gut and the standard dysfunctions that you see within the gut. Here's another review paper that looks at the gut microbiota inflammatory bowel disease. One of the things they showed, and again, this is a review of numerous papers on IBD, they show that low diversity is a major driver of inflammatory bowel disease. That's Crohn's and colitis, and colorectal cancer can fit in there as well. So they talk about while some results related to dysbiosis and IBD are different between studies owing to variations in sample types, the most consistent observation in IBD is reduced bacterial diversity. So when they compare people who have IBD versus people who don't, looking at age match cohorts, sex match cohorts, and so on, similar patient profiles, the most consistent finding is low diversity is a characteristic of people with IBD. So they talk about a number of trials that have shown that therapies that correct this dysbiosis, including fecal microbiota transplants, which some people are opting to look at, and certain types of probiotics are promising in IBD therapy because they correct this type of characteristic dysbiosis. Here's one of the keystone strains that we talked about, the Akkermansia. So the A here stands for Akkermansia muciniphila. This is, again, a review paper. They call it a mini review because they looked at just a dozen or so papers. But what's really amazing about Akkermansia is it's inversely associated with obesity, diabetes, cardiometabolic disease, and low-grade inflammation. So basically, everything that falls under the cardiometabolic spectrum. There are somewhere around 60 diseases that fall under cardiometabolic spectrum, and Akkermansia is inversely associated, meaning the higher level of Akkermansia you have, the more protected you are against all of these conditions, the less risk you have for these conditions. So they talk about how Akkermansia muciniphila is widely considered a novel potential candidate to improve metabolic disorders, including obesity, diabetes, liver disease, and cardiometabolic disorders. And they found in certain interventional studies that when you administer or you increase the growth of Akkermansia, it can profoundly reduce the development of these diseases. So they've been able to show that when you implant or increase Akkermansia, you can actually reverse diabetes. It can arrest the process of diabetes, even in someone that's obese, and reverse the process of diabetes and restore pancreatic islet cell function, restore central insulin resistance in the brain, and then actually start burning fat as well to reduce body weight. So this is an amazing discovery that there's this single bacteria in your very complex microbiome that affords so much protection against all of these conditions, which are the top 4 or 5 killers in the United States and the Western world as well. Single bacteria that can do that. So if we can somehow increase this bacteria, we can have a significant impact in these really important disorders. Here's one of the other keystone strains. So F. prosnitzi is Faecalibacter prosnitzi. That's one of the ones I mentioned. Again, this is a review article that looks at dozens of other studies. And here they talk about the abundance of Faecalibacter prosnitzi was decreased in IBD patients compared to healthy controls. So in summary, in their meta-analysis, and if you're not familiar with the meta-analysis, that's again looking at a variety of papers on the same subject, analyzing the results across the board and kind of coming to a consensus. And their systemic review suggests a possible protective benefit of F. prosnitzi against the development of IBD, that's Crohn's and colitis. Therefore, further treatment such as probiotics or prebiotics that increase Faecalibacter prosnitzi in IBD could lead to significant outcomes. So this is really interesting when you look at how protective Faecalibacter prosnitzi is in inflammatory conditions in the bowel, which also lead to other conditions. It's really significant to think that if we can increase Faecalibacter prosnitzi, we could protect against these conditions. So again, increasing Faecalibacter prosnitzi can afford significant protection against inflammatory conditions in the bowel. Increasing Akkermansia protects against the 60-odd diseases that are under the metabolic disease spectrum, including things like diabetes, heart disease, inflammatory conditions, hormone imbalances, dementia. And then early on, they looked at dysbiosis and low diversity in IBD as well. So all of these different conditions coming down to kind of the same dysbiosis and same dysfunctions. Here's a nice perspective. This is a editorial, I believe, that talks about the barrier function of the epithelium. And they talk about how the 3 studies that they looked at show that the gut barrier dysfunction is involved in IBD, autoimmune disease, and systemic infection. We know a lot of people suffer from things like chronic Epstein-Barr virus or chronic cytomegalovirus, or even lupus that stems from a chronic infection of some sort, or Lyme disease. These chronic systemic infectious conditions can drive many other secondary problems, and themselves can be really, really difficult to deal with. And they're looking at how the gut barrier plays a significant role in these conditions, and how a dysfunctional barrier is characteristic in most of these functions. They talk about pathogenic bacteria can induce intestinal defects and translocation. Remember, we talked about the translocation of even your commensal bacteria, let alone pathogenic and other problematic bacteria, across that mucosal structure, because once they translocate and they enter the circulatory system, they end up in the lymph nodes and the liver, triggering systemic autoimmune type of disease like lupus. So, this same system that you saw on that second slide is driving all of these conditions, including autoimmune diseases like lupus, IBD, and other dysfunctions as well. Here's another one, and I brought this in because this is really important to note how different this condition is from the other ones we've been talking about, and yet it's the same type of mucosal dysfunction. This is the pathophysiology of depression, right? So most people would not relate depression to IBD, to Crohn's or colitis, to diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And yet we now know that the mucosal dysfunction, the intestinal mucosal dysfunction, and the translocation of the bacteria that I talk about in the leakiness of gut plays a significant role in the inflammatory pathophysiology of depression. Pathophysiology means the pathway in which the disease develops. So the big driver of the disease or the root cause of the disease. Again, a very different conditions than the other ones we talked about, but same dysfunction, same mucosal dysfunction, same translocation of bacteria, same dysfunction in the barrier system of the gut. All of this starts with dysbiosis. Here's another condition, again, another review paper on gastroesophageal reflux disease. Same kind of mucosal immune dysfunction or mucosal barrier dysfunction. The disruption of the epithelial barrier they talk about in this particular one. Same type of dysfunction, a very different disease, right? If you look at depression and GERD couldn't be more different in terms of how they are expressed physiologically in people, and most people would never relate reflux to depression, and yet they have the same common dysfunction that's driving the disease. And let me remind you, these are all review papers again. So this is the consensus in the science. This is not a single study that's showing this. These are when you review dozens up to 100 papers on this topic, this is what the consensus is showing. It's the same dysfunction. I put this in that shows a mucosal immune dysfunction in HIV. This is really important because HIV acts as a really good representation, but a very accelerated form of that whole dysfunction I talked about, where it starts with dysbiosis, you end up with low keystone strains, low diversity, low postbiotics like short-chain fatty acids, the breakdown of the mucosal structure, breakdown of mucosal immune response, the breakdown of the barrier structure, the tight junctions in the gut lining, and then the translocation. That process is the same exact thing that happens in early HIV infection, which accelerates the condition. In fact, the NIH published a study, I think it was in 2014, that showed that mucosal dysfunction and leakiness in the gut is the biggest driver of mortality in HIV subjects. And HIV is a great model to study because, again, it's an accelerated version of what's happening in the standard American gut. And then this is one of the studies I mentioned earlier where you can actually look at the diversity of the microbiome in people who had a long, healthy life over the age of 90. The most characteristic thing about them was their diversity of the microbiome was actually greater than that of young adult control subjects. So people who ended up living a healthier, longer life, their most distinctive characteristic was having this high diversity in the microbiome. So longevity in itself is dictated by the diversity in your microbiome. This is really important. There's more and more studies coming out on this whole topic. So, we talked about the standard American gut, the standard dysfunctions, and ultimately the biggest driver, a lot of chronic illness, when you have this characteristic dysfunction like we showed you earlier, is this stuff here, this pesky LPS, lipopolysaccharide. These lipopolysaccharides are endotoxins, so they're toxins that are generated within the microbiome itself. So these aren't things that you can prevent your exposure of from the outside world. These are endotoxins that are derived in the gut itself. And then when your gut is leaky and you have that whole standard American gut characteristic dysfunction that we went over, you end up with this LPS leaking through on a regular basis, especially when you're digesting food. So this process increases dramatically during the process of digesting food and eating food. And for that reason, this endotoxemia is actually called metabolic endotoxemia. And it's been very, very well studied and very well documented. The effects of this LPS being allowed to leak through, translocate, and enter the circulatory system has been extremely well documented and established. And I'll show you some studies on that as well. So remember, all of this starts with dysbiosis up here, dysfunction in the diversity, dysfunction in the keystone strains, all of this disruption in the mucosal structure. Ultimately, what this leads to is this kind of LPS and a couple other endotoxins that are allowed to migrate through and influx into the circulatory system. But this happens at greater rates during the process of digestion. So this whole process is called metabolic endotoxemia. So let's talk about that a little bit. As I mentioned, it's essentially an innate immune response. So every time these toxins are allowed to enter your circulatory system, that abbreviated LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide, it triggers an innate immune response, which becomes subclinical, persistent, and leads to this low-grade inflammation because of your body now has circulating endotoxins. This endotoxemia is characterized to affect somewhere around 50% of the healthy Western population. It's more than likely quite a bit higher than that, certainly in people over the age of 30, and anyone with any sort of health condition, metabolic endotoxemia is likely much more prevalent, probably close to 80 or 90%. It happens, the highest increase happens within the first 5 hours of eating a meal, especially a meal that's high in calories, tends to promote this even more. And meals that are high in certain types of fat also promote this quite a bit. And then basically once the endotoxin enters the circulation, you start getting an increase in things like interleukin-6, interleukin-1 beta, interferon gamma, triglycerides, and it also screws up postprandial insulin response. So these inflammatory cytokines are now taking over because the LPS is in there. It's triggered the process of cytokine expression, and now you've got systemic inflammation driven by these cytokines. The chronic metabolic endotoxemia, meaning this occurring every time you eat food because your gut is dysfunctional, your gut is leaky, leads to a whole bunch of chronic illnesses like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, in men, hypogonadism, which is low testosterone production, autoimmune disease, even things like anxiety and depression. I'll show you some of those studies in the upcoming slides. So here are the clinical manifestations of LPS-induced chronic immune activation. So remember, when LPS is allowed to leak through on a regular basis, especially after a meal where it increases by 5-6-fold, the immune activation related to this LPS is at the root cause of many chronic illnesses. So that's what you'll see here. Basically, again, everything under the metabolic syndrome spectrum. So heart disease, dyslipidemia, so elevated triglycerides, elevated cholesterol, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, dementia, even things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, cancers, a variety of cancers, including, of course, bowel-related cancers, but even breast cancers, melanoma, all of these things are driven by LPS endotoxemia, polycystic ovarian syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So all of these huge variety of conditions are all driven at the root cause by this LPS being allowed to leak through on a regular basis. So here's some of the studies that show that. I'm not going to belabor you guys and go through each one in any detail, but it's just to show you that there's significant amount of evidence showing the understanding and the pathophysiology of where these diseases come from. So here's a paper that looked, and this is actually published by the American Diabetic Association, where they established that endotoxemia, the metabolic endotoxemia, every time you eat, the influx of LPS into your circulation actually initiates obesity and insulin resistance. So it's the first step in having a dysfunctional metabolic system where you struggle with weight management, where you struggle to keep off the pounds, especially the building of visceral fat in your abdomen area, and then of course the insulin resistance and other metabolic functions that come along. They also show that it plays a significant role in the onset of metabolic disease, and it can actually dismantle some of the tight junctions. So increased levels of leaky gut actually perpetuate more leaky gut as a self-perpetuating problem, because the more these types of endotoxins are allowed to leak through, the more they create inflammation in the intestinal lining, which leads to further and further leaky gut. So again, it's a self-perpetuating problem that just it's really hard to arrest and get better unless you focus on totally restoring your gut. They've also shown elevated endotoxin levels in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. There are large institutions like the Cleveland Clinic that are studying non-alcoholic fatty liver disease because it's becoming such a big chronic problem in the Western world. It used to be that if people had fatty liver disease, it was because of one or two things. It was because of alcohol abuse, or it was because of hepatitis. Now they're seeing non-hepatitis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that's leading to liver failure in patients, and people are dying because of liver failure or eventually liver cancer. And they're trying to figure out, where is this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease coming from? There are numerous publications that show that the leaky gut and elevated toxin migration is one of the biggest drivers of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Here's some other studies showing that the leaking of this LPS through a dysfunctional gut microbiome and mucosal structure and intestinal lining can be a major inducer of autoimmune disease, whether it's in collaboration with cytomegalovirus and other chronic infections, or on its own by itself. So that, just evidence to show that this plays a significant role in triggering really important conditions like autoimmune disease as well. Here's another study. Actually, this was also published by the American Diabetic Association, showing that the primary insult in the onset of type 2 diabetes comes from the circulating endotoxins from the gut, postprandial exposure. So again, postprandial is after food exposure to circulating endotoxins. This is the biggest driver of type 2 diabetes. And remember, when you develop type 2 diabetes, your risk for all other chronic conditions increases quite dramatically. You have 4 times higher risk for cardiovascular disease. You have almost double the risk for cancers, for other inflammatory conditions, immune dysfunctions, Alzheimer's, and senile dementia. Your risk more than doubles when you have diabetes. So this endotoxemia that's driving diabetes also becomes the biggest driver of the other comorbidities associated with diabetes. This is a really interesting study, just published, I think, early this year or end of last year. Published in early last year in 2018. They basically followed something like 462 high-risk diabetes patients. So these are people that did not have diabetes but were a high risk for diabetes, which means they were probably obese, had some family history, had other aspects of metabolic syndrome, and they were following them to see of all of the conditions that they had, which were the biggest drivers to create type 2 diabetes. The one and only thing that they found consistently across the board was high postprandial endotoxemia. That means that elevation of LPS in the circulation after a meal. So they're from the leaky gut, from the translocation, from the dysbiosis that's occurring. They show that, and they even conclude that their results show that the potential use of LPS plasma levels as one of the most important biomarkers for predicting type 2 diabetes. None of the patients that ended up developing type 2 diabetes had low levels of LPS circulation. All of them had high levels of LPS circulation, and the ones that did not develop type 2 diabetes had low levels of LPS circulation despite having other risk factors like obesity and other aspects of metabolic syndrome. So the biggest driver of all of these dysfunctions is this circulating LPS that occurs because your gut function is totally off. So again, the standard American gut driving the translocation of LPS, especially postprandial after a meal. This is another study, I think this was published by the American Diabetic Association as well. It shows that this LPS, this pesky LPS from the gut, and once it leaks through into the circulation, can actually get into the deep recesses of the brain and cause something called central insulin resistance. So this is not insulin resistance that affects the pancreas, the islet cells. This is insulin resistance that disrupts the brain's ability to detect and communicate with the rest of the body of what your blood sugar levels are. So that's a amazing thing, because you're going right at the CPU and you're dysfunctioning and creating a dysfunction within the CPU itself. So they talk about the prolonged exposure to this endotoxin that occurs every time you eat a meal underlies the development of insulin resistance, but starting in the brain, in the hypothalamus itself. So that's how pervasive this LPS can be. It can enter places like the deep recesses of the brain. And this is another study from September 2017 that shows that the microbiome-derived LPS, once it's allowed to leak through into the circulatory system, can get into the perinuclear regions of the brain and start the process of beta plaquing that leads to Alzheimer's disease. So, for years we've known that inflammatory conditions in the brain lead to the disruption of the brain tissue and the beta plaquing that you see in Alzheimer's. Now we know that it's actually the endotoxin from the gut that's leaking through and getting into that region of the brain that's causing this immune activation of the brain that leads to something like Alzheimer's. And then here's a number of conditions. I would have to have 400 slides to show you each one of these and the studies associated with them, but I summarize all of them in this particular chart. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but just a couple of them I'll mention. Things like depression and cognitive decline are really important because a lot of people are suffering from that and they don't really know the cause behind it, and neither do your doctors. They can't really understand where the anxiety, where the depression is coming from, where the cognitive decline, the forgetfulness, the loss of memory, where those things are coming from. As it turns out, this LPS, when it's allowed to leak through, can create inflammation in the blood-brain barrier. It can enter deep recesses of the brain like the amygdala and the hippocampus and disrupt memory function. It can, in fact, disrupt serotonin binding and dopamine binding, which can lead to anxiety and depression. It can even get into sensory neurons in something called the dorsal root nociceptors and bind these nociceptors, which will then scream out pain signals in the body. So this is likely where most fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome comes from, and also non-specific pain not associated with any specific injury. Parkinson's, of course, very similar to Alzheimer's in terms of its pathophysiology, but the LPS can get into intracranial spaces and create activation through the microglia cells, which can lead to neuronal loss, which can lead to Parkinson's. Hypogonadism, I mentioned that earlier, low testosterone in men. There's something called the Gelding theory that shows that elevated LPS and immune activation associated with LPS starts to bring down testosterone production in men in their mid to late 30s and beyond. Autoimmune disease, I showed you that as well. So the purpose of all of these studies that I've been inundating you with is to show you how pervasive this LPS is. When you have the standard American gut that's causing all of this dysfunction, starting with a dysbiosis that ultimately leads to LPS leaking through into your circulatory system on a regular chronic basis, you end up being susceptible to all of these different conditions. Metabolic syndrome, diabetes, I showed you those studies. And then looking at all these, we've got things like anxiety, depression, anorexia nervosa, low testosterone, cognitive decline, mood and appetite disorders, leptin resistance, chronic constipation, in this case, which is actually the biggest driver of SIBO as well, the stasis and the chronic constipation. This huge variety of chronic conditions all coming from the same root cause. And that's the most important thing that we've discovered through all of the microbiome research. So again, to review that, and sorry to beat a dead horse, but it's so important for you guys to understand where these chronic conditions are coming from. It always starts with dysbiosis, and that means low keystone strains and low diversity within your microbiome. When you have low keystone strains and low diversity, you end up with low postbiotics, so low short-chain fatty acids as an example, especially butyrate, propionate, and acetate. And again, low levels of these short-chain fatty acids are very characteristic of a significant number of chronic illnesses. Now, when that starts to happen, you get a disrupted mucosal structure, so things start to translocate to the inner part of the mucosa, and that leads to a disrupted immune response in the mucosa as well. So it's a chronic inflammatory immune response in the mucosa. You're getting no adaptation, no building of tolerance. You're becoming more and more sensitive to more foods. You're becoming more and more sensitive to more chemicals around you, more environmental factors. All of the things are starting to disrupt how your body responds to the world around you, and you're becoming more sensitive and less resilient. Ultimately, that leads to a dysfunction of the gut barrier itself. And then on a regular basis, every time you eat food, you get too much LPS and other toxins spiking and migrating into your circulatory system. And that sets up all of these conditions that I just showed you. So this is what's happening in the standard American gut. This is what's happening when I talk to doctors, functional medicine doctors. I say, whether it's that Hashimoto's patient that came in the morning, or the diabetic that came in the afternoon, or later on in that day, someone that comes in that has severe anxiety and depression, although those clinical manifestations of the disease are quite different, this same thing is happening in all of their guts. So if we can just reverse this process, starting with the dysbiosis and then increasing these keystone strains, increasing diversity, rebuilding this mucosal structure and stopping the migration of LPS and other toxins through, you can fix all of those patients in a similar way. You don't have to figure out very different therapies for each of those different conditions because they're all driven by the same root cause. So that's where the total gut restoration came in. It's that understanding of the standard pathophysiology in most chronic illnesses. And then we now have a system of reversing that and fixing each of those components on their own. So the first part is to fix the microbiome, because remember, everything starts with the dysbiosis. So it starts with that dysfunctional microbiome. It starts with that low levels of keystone strains and low diversity. So we need to increase keystone strains and we need to increase diversity. Once we start making that important change within the microbiome, which we call reconditioning the gut using the spore-based probiotics, and I'll show you some data on that, the next step is to affirm this new microbiome, because your microbiome can bobble around a little bit and fluctuate from day to day, especially because you're surrounded by things that are always harming your microbiome. So it's constantly pushing the microbiome in the negative direction, and we want to bring it back and reaffirm this really strong, diverse, healthy microbiome with high levels of keystone strains. So the second part is to reinforce that healthy microbiome. And you do that by using certain precision prebiotics, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But what we need is a prebiotic that works well with the right probiotic. The combination of those two is called a synbiotic, that their effects are complementary and would multiply on one another. So number one, we have to establish a higher, more stable population, and then increase the postbiotics, the things like short chain fatty acids. Once we've got a new microbiome that's more diverse, that has more keystone strains, that's now producing more short chain fatty acids and looking healthier, then we need to rebuild the mucosal structure and the intestinal lining in a process that we call intestinal mucosal rebuilding. And in that, we use certain immunoglobulins, polyphenols, and amino acids to provide the tools to the new microbiome in order to reduce mucosal and intestinal inflammation, to be able to rebuild the mucosal structure itself, to modulate the immune response in the mucosa, to reestablish the tolerance, to reestablish the adaptive immune response so your immune system is not reacting erroneously to everything it sees, to provide the building blocks to rebuild the mucosal structure itself, and then to reduce the pathogen effect. So being able to neutralize pathogens that are chronically present in your mucosal structure, both in your gut and other parts of the body as well. So this system, this recondition, reinforce, and rebuild, is what we call the total gut restoration. And it addresses that standard American gut dysfunction in a systemic way. So these are the three products associated with that. The Megaspore Biotic is a spore-based probiotic that's been shown both in published studies and soon to be published studies, human clinical trials, to be able to recondition the bowel and start changing the microbiome in terms of diversity and those keystone strains, and then also start to fix the leakiness in the gut. And then the second part, the reinforced part, is done by Mega Prebiotic, which is a unique precision prebiotic made up of 4 key oligosaccharides that specifically feed the important keystone strains that the Megaspore is now increasing the growth of. So it comes in and it reaffirms that new microbiome. It also dramatically increases the production of short chain fatty acids. I'll show you some of that data. And then the last part is the Mega Mucosa, which is the part that produces or that provides the flavonoids, the polyphenols, the immunoglobulins, and the amino acids that then reduce mucosal inflammation, allows your mucosa to rebuild, provides a building block to the mucosa, and then further dampens the inflammatory response in the gut and other mucosal tissues as well. So this is the general system, and we can talk about sometimes how you would deviate from going from 1 to 2 to 3. In some cases, you might go to 1 to 3 at the same time and then add in 2 later on. So we can chat about that in the Q&A section a little bit But let me just show you some data. And this is soon to be published. This study is actually going through peer review. What we wanted to prove was the impact of the probiotic alone, the recondition step, and then when we add in the reinforced step, the symbiotic side with the prebiotic, what the dramatic increase is on the difference. And this is in the human microbiome. We're looking at changes to the population of the human microbiome. The first one is one of those keystone strains, Faecalum bacterioprosnitzi. This blue bar is in the control, so this was before using the probiotic in this microbiome. We see relatively low levels of this really important keystone strain. Now, once we added the probiotic in, this is after 3 weeks of using the probiotic, we see a significant increase in this keystone strain. Now, when you look at this as a figure, it might look like double, but this is actually a log scale. So if you're not familiar with a log scale, if you go from 2.2 times 10 to the 6 to 3.2 times 10 to the 7, that's not an increase in 1 point. That's a tenfold increase in the number of bacteria that are Faecalum bacterioprosnitzi. And that's in the transverse colon. So in the ascending colon, we see no Faecalum bacterioprosnitzi, and that's normal because F. prosnitzi tends to be in the distal part of the colon, typically in the descending colon, in the distal end of the descending colon. And so in this case, we saw a 2 log increase. So it went from 3.3 times 10 to the 5 to a 3.6 times 10 to the 7. That's actually 100-fold increase in the population of Faecalum bacterioprosnitzi. Remember, this is a log scale, so it's not a 2-point increase. It's a 100-fold increase. That's how significant the growth of this keystone strain is when we add in the spore-based bacteria. They're naturally increasing the growth of your really important keystone strains. Now look what happens when we add in the prebiotic. It goes from 10 to the 7 to 10 to the 10 in both the transverse colon and the descending colon. Again, this is a log scale, so this is 1,000-fold increase in Faecalum bacterioprosnitzi when you add in both the prebiotic and the probiotic. So the true symbiotic, we're seeing a huge jump in this Faecalum bacterioprosnitzi population. That's a very significant thing. There's been nothing, I can guarantee you, in the literature that shows this kind of increase in this very important keystone strain when you look at the probiotic and the prebiotic effect, especially the combination. Here's some of the lactobacillus. So they're looking at some of the key lactobacillus. We saw a significant change in the key lactobacillus in the microbiome. And then when we added in the prebiotic, we saw even a greater change, in some of these cases, 2 log change, which is 100-fold increase in lactobacillus. So in your normal commensal good lactobacillus within your gut. And then we looked at bifidobacterium. The microbiome actually had relatively high levels of bifidobacterium to begin with. So we saw some change, not a huge amount, which is good because, again, you don't want to overgrow any given bacteria. So because they already had relatively high levels of bifidobacterium, there wasn't a significant change. And same thing when we added in the prebiotic, we saw a further change, but again, not a huge dramatic change like in some of the other microbes where we were seeing hundreds and thousands of fold increase. This was just like a 40-50% increase. But again, that's because they already started off with a relatively high amount of bifidobacteria. So this is actually great to see because what we're showing is a modulation of the population. We're not necessarily just dramatically increasing things that didn't need to be increased. We're seeing a slight increase in things that needed a slight increase, but a significant increase in strains that needed a significant increase. Akkermansia, even with the probiotic alone, it was actually still below detection level, but then when we added the combination of the probiotic and prebiotic, we started to see Akkermansia coming up, and we started to see very significant growth in Akkermansia. So again, we can reestablish these keystone strains by doing the recondition and reinforce step of the total gut restoration. I can assure you there's nothing else on the market that brings back these keystone strains in this way. And in fact, very few things actually bring back the keystone strains at all. And that's really important when you understand the dysfunction in the standard American gut that leads to all the chronic illnesses. We need to reestablish the microbiome from the dysbiosis, and that starts with reestablishing the keystone strains. Now, once you reestablish the keystone strains, you also start to see the postbiotic production increasing quite a bit. So here's a production of short-chain fatty acids. I know this graph may be hard to understand, but what you need to see here is that when you add the probiotic alone, we get anywhere from a 70 like a 24, 28% to 70% increase in short chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Again, production of short chain fatty acids is a sign of a healthy microbiome. Low levels of short chain fatty acids are characteristic of numerous chronic conditions. So this is a really significant change. But then when we add in the prebiotic, the change goes from 80 to 140%. So again, the combination of the recondition and reinforce phases of total gut restoration really dramatically change the microbiome, and then of course all of the things that the microbiome are producing, like short chain fatty acids. Now remember, diversity is also a really important thing. There's a measure of diversity called the reciprocal Simpson diversity index, and the higher the number, the more diverse the microbiome is. When you look at just adding the probiotic alone, we are almost doubling diversity in the ascending colon, transverse colon, and descending colon. In these cases, we're seeing a 40, 50% increase in diversity within these aspects of the microbiome. That's huge. Nothing else has been shown to increase diversity in this significant way. And then when you add in the prebiotic, the diversity increases even more dramatically. So again, this symbiotic effect on the microbiome is to fix this characteristic dysbiosis, that is the low keystone strains and low diversity. We can fix it now with the recondition and reinforce phases of the microbiome. This is so powerful that when I did this presentation, it spawned a big research study at the Mitchell Cancer Institute at University of Southern Alabama, because Dr. Arthur Frankel, who's a head researcher there on immunotherapy for melanoma, has known that low diversity and low keystone strains is a big determining factor in whether or not a patient responds to checkpoint therapy or immunotherapy in the treatment of melanoma. So because of this information, he's now doing a study using the recondition and reinforce phase of the total total gut restoration to test and see if you can improve the response rate of checkpoint therapy. And that is so important, because when you look at melanoma, which is one of the most leading cancers in the Western world, in the United States, immunotherapy or checkpoint therapy works in about 25% of people. But in the people that it works in, it works amazingly well, and their recurrence rate of the cancer is really low. But in 75% of the people, it has no response at all. And that's been a huge issue in the field of oncology as to why some people respond really well to checkpoint or immunotherapy and others don't. And Arthur Frankel's work has shown that diversity and the presence of these keystone strains is a major determining factor in whether or not that immunotherapy is going to help. And so imagine if the study proves what we think it'll prove, that we can take that 25% response rate to even 50% or 70%, just by reconditioning and reinforcing the microbiome, bringing back the keystone strains and bringing back the diversity before they start their immunotherapy. Think about the number of lives that'll be saved and impacted just from that change alone. So it's really exciting. We are really kind of pushing the cutting edge of a lot of this research. In the rebuild phase, one of the most important ingredients in the rebuild phase is a bovine serum immunoglobulin. That's such an important product. It's actually one of my favorite compounds and products. I take it all the time because I put my body through a lot of stress as I travel a lot. I'm in planes and hotels all the time, and I'm traveling. I sleep in 4 or 5 different countries and time zones in a single week, all of the time. And so my body goes through a lot of stress. This bovine IgG is one of the most important things that I take. They've done numerous studies on HIV subjects. If you recall, I mentioned in HIV subjects, this whole standard American gut dysfunction, starting with dysbiosis, is accelerated significantly. So they've been able to show that with this serum immunoglobulin, it can increase the types of adaptive T cells that are in the mucosa. It improves gut function and improves the repair of the mucosal and gut structure, even in HIV enteropathy, which is a real severe aggressive form of what's happening. They even showed in a pediatric ulcerative colitis study that it can heal the gastric mucosa in ulcerative colitis in kids. That's how powerful this compound is. These immunoglobulins can go in, neutralize toxins, neutralize LPS, reduce inflammation in the mucosal structure so that your mucosa can get rebuilt itself. They even decrease pediatric UC activity index. So ulcerative colitis is described by different indexes in terms of severity of disease. When you can decrease the severity of disease and move someone from one index to the other, that's a very significant finding, because you're basically fixing structures within the gut that were completely dysfunctional. They also showed that this immunoglobulin can actually bind and neutralize many different toxins, from C. diff and other pathogens, including mold toxins like aflatoxin. So it's a really important part of the rebuild phase, because we need to reduce the inflammation in the mucosa as things are translocating through, and neutralize toxins, neutralize pathogens in order for the mucosal structure to rebuild. Then the other part of the rebuild structure of the microbiome total gut restoration are these flavonoids or polyphenols. And there have been a few studies on the polyphenols, but one of the things they show is reducing increased intestinal inflammation. They block the stress activity pathways. This is the same pathway that actually leads to dysfunction in your tight junctions, as well as the central insulin resistance that we talked about. It protects against experimental colitis. So in an animal model, when they're trying to induce colitis, so that's inflammation in the colon, this polyphenol or flavonoid mix reduces that and can protect against it. It reduces the risk for the IBD. They've also shown the ability to increase more butyrate production and reduce fecal calprotectin, which actually looks at a damaged intestinal lining. So high levels of calprotectin are indicative that there's damage going on to the intestinal lining. This shows a reduction of that by 22%. So this becomes another really important part of the rebuild phase, because remember, we have recondition with the spores that gets in there and starts changing the dysbiosis, then reinforced with the prebiotic. The prebiotic comes in and it helps reestablish a new population. And then this is the rebuild phase, where we're providing these tools to the microbiome to rebuild the mucosa and the intestinal lining. And speaking of rebuilding, this is really important. These 4 amino acids are the key building blocks to the mucosal structure, both in the intestines and everywhere else in the body as well. Here's a study that was done that showed that when you damage the mucosa deliberately and you add in these 4 amino acids, it rebuilds and reestablishes mucin synthesis. That's the compound that makes up your mucosa by 95%. So this becomes a really important tool to the rebuilding phase of the mucosa. And again, ultimately, all of this only matters if you can stop that LPS from migrating through, right? And we were able to show this in this published study from August of 2017, that when we rebuild the gut, we can stop LPS migrating through. And this is what it looks like when you take people that have leaky gut endotoxemia, you give them a meal. This is the amount of LPS in their circulatory system. So at time 0, they're coming in fasted. We give them a meal here. And then within 3 and 5 hours, we look at this 6-fold increase in that LPS now moving around in the circulation. And remember that LPS is the one that triggers all the inflammatory responses, gets into the places like your brain, your joints, your pancreas, and creates all of these chronic illnesses. This is what we see in those subjects in the circulatory system. After we gave them the probiotic for 30 days and helped reestablish the gut, this is what it looks like next time we challenge them. So almost a complete blunting of the migration of LPS into the circulatory system. So we can stop the root cause of most of these chronic illnesses by just addressing those common dysfunctions in the gut. And let me show you just a couple other pieces of data. We were able to establish the gut-brain connection by fixing that aspect of the gut as well. So this shows you ghrelin response, which is your hunger hormone. If you come in a fasted state, you would imagine that ghrelin levels are high, which shows here. But then this is at baseline before giving them the treatment. Once we gave them a 2,000 calorie meal, you see ghrelin levels barely drop and then start to increase again very quickly. This means that the communication between your gut and your brain is disrupted, because it's your gut's job to tell your brain that you have enough food, so stop eating. Now, when we did the probiotic and restoration of the gut after 30 days, you see ghrelin levels in response to the meal dropping dramatically. So we're reestablishing that gut-brain communication, which is really important. We also see changes in triglyceride levels. When triglycerides is a really important marker of damage to the liver and stress that the liver and their body's going through. So we see a significant change in triglyceride levels that was seen when you treated individuals with a probiotic with a reinforcement phase, but you don't see it in the placebo group at all. And then this kind of gives you an overall inflammatory picture. So this is something called a heat map. The more red and orange the color, the more intense the response is. And in the placebo group, you see how inflamed they were systemically versus in the treatment group, we saw a significant reduction in overall inflammation in 30 days of working with gut restoration in these subjects. So very, very significant. The total gut restoration is really important because understanding this pathophysiology of how the gut and the microbiome's involvement in disease, in the causation, in the progression is paramount to be able to treat these diseases. This is what I reinforce with the doctors I work with all the time is you have to understand this pathophysiology of where reflux is coming from, where depression is coming from, where diabetes is coming from, where autoimmune disease is coming from, because once you understand the pathophysiology, then you can really start to work to treat it by reversing that pathology. Even though these diseases are quite varied, the gut-associated dysfunction are essentially the same, right? GERD couldn't be more different than depression from a clinical standpoint, but when you look at the root cause, it's exactly the same. And this means that there can be some degree of uniformity or baseline treatment for various conditions, things like autoimmune disease, cardiometabolic syndrome, IBD, reflux, that are all seemingly unrelated conditions. They can all be addressed in the same way with respect to the gut and the microbiota, which is the primary driver of all of these conditions anyway. So that's the exciting news, because we don't have to do a completely different therapy for someone who's on autoimmune disease or completely different therapy for someone who has depression or reflux or IBD. We can do the same base fixing of the dysfunction in all of these varied conditions. Strategically addressing the dysfunctions in the microbiota and the mucosal system and the barrier function can be highly effective in treating a variety of chronic diseases, but it can also be highly effective in alleviating the risk for further chronic diseases. Because again, much of these chronic illnesses come from the same thing. So even though you are currently only suffering from Hashimoto's, it doesn't mean that the same dysfunction, chronic dysfunction that led to Hashimoto's isn't going to also cause Alzheimer's or diabetes or cardiovascular disease down the road. So stopping it now is going to be really important for health and restoration down the road as well. And the same treatment, like I mentioned, can be preventative for numerous conditions. So it can treat conditions, but because we're addressing the root cause, we can also prevent upcoming conditions as well. So this is a total gut restoration. Starts with the the recondition phase with the Megaspore biotic. That starts to change the dysbiosis. Then we come in and reinforce those changes with the Mega Prebiotic. And then this also dramatically increases the production of short chain fatty acids, which are paramount to the repair phase. And then we come in and we add in the Mega Mucosa to provide the building blocks, the bovine IgG, the flavobiotics or polyphenols, the citrus polyphenols, and then the 4 key amino acids as the tools to rebuild the mucosal structure and rebuild the gut lining. Now, typically we would do it in this circular manner, where we would start with this for the first 30 days. At the end of that 30 days, we would continue with the Megaspore, where we would add in the Mega Prebiotic, and we would be doing both of them together for 30 days. And then at the end of that next phase, we would bring in the Mega Mucosa and add it in as well. We would maintain the prebiotic and the probiotic, but we would bring in the mucosa and do that for another 30 days. So we're talking about a 90-day restructuring program or restoration program, where you would have done 3 bottles of the Mega Probiotic, 2 bottles of the Mega Prebiotic, and 1 bottle of the Mega Mucosa. At the end of that 90 days, you basically stop. If you're working with your practitioner or doctor, you kind of assess where you are, how you're doing, if you're making significant improvement. If you're in a good place, then what you can do is just maintain the Megaspore Biotic as your daily maintenance, your daily protection, and use these two intermittently. And it's important to note that both of these are powders. So you're basically mixing a scoop of it in water and drinking, and you can take them both at the same time. You can do a scoop of each and consume them at the same time. I end up using both of these intermittently. I do it 2 or 3 times a week, but I take my Megaspore every single day, and then I take a standalone IgG called Mega IgG, so that I get the higher dose of just the IgG as my daily protection as well. So I do this, and the Mega IgG is my daily protection, and I ended up using both of these maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Most of the subjects that we work with, we start them on this process, and I mentioned the deviation from this particular process. If you are somebody, or you have somebody that is really sensitive, that suffers from a lot of die-off, what we may do is actually start them on the Mega Mucosa to get some of that IgG in them, or start them on the standalone Mega IgG so that you get a higher dose of the IgG. We do that for a couple of weeks, and then introduce the Megaspore Biotic for 30 days. Then we do these 2 products, and then bring in the Mega Prebiotic at the end. So that's a deviation that we have. Now, if you start the spores and you start to feel too much die-off, too much cramping, discomfort, loose stool, then you can add in the Mega Mucosa to kind of dampen some of that inflammatory or Herxheimer detox response. So that is the end of this talk. So I will throw it over to Joe, and we can chat a little bit more.
All right, amazing stuff as usual, Karan. Thanks so much. That's that's why we keep you around, Karan.
My pleasure.
Blowing people's minds as usual. I know Jason has some follow-up questions to that presentation and wants to go over some lifestyle stuff, so we'll get to that in a few minutes. I'm sure that there's plenty of people who are wondering exactly where to get the products that you talked about, the Megaspore, the Mega Prebiotic, and the Mega Mucosa. If you look right below this video, there's more information on how you can order that. Now, typically, each of those products cost $55 to purchase. But because we're really grateful, really fortunate to have this relationship with Karan and his company, we're able to offer these products to you at a pretty significant discount. Like I said, they usually sell for $55. If you buy what we call the Mega 3-pack, which is the probiotic, the prebiotic, and the mucosa, you're going to save 10%, so a little over $16 on each of those orders. You can also choose auto ship. And honestly, the majority of the people choose auto ship, and it's obvious because you're actually saving 15% on your order. When you choose auto ship, you're saving about $25 per order on that, and that's actually locked in. So as long as you have auto ship, you're going to save that $15 order over order over order. So you'll continue to make those to get those savings for as long as you're on auto ship. So all the information about the products and how to order is below. So I'll let Jason take over here. I know he's got some questions for you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I've been using Megaspore for a number of years now for myself and clients, and the Mega Prebiotic and Mega Mucosa are relatively new. And so when those came out, I was pretty eager to try those, and they've been pretty amazing. And I honestly like the original order that you have, Karan. To me, that works best because you're increasing the population of the microbiota and those key strains, as you mentioned, feeding those, and then all the polyphenols and everything that's coming in the mucosa, those can't really be as effective unless we have those strains, right? So to me, the way you guys have it structured is fantastic. I actually personally use all 3 at the same time. That's just because that's just how I roll. I just do that type of stuff. I just like to throw everything at it, and hopefully it works better. And for me, it's worked really well. I would say for those people that have really serious gut issues and maybe serious symptoms, taking it a bit slower tends to be a little bit more effective in my experience with that stuff. But I wanted to ask you too, Karan, just to clarify a few things, because I've had a lot of clients ask me about using these with their kids or even their pets, because they've had so much success for themselves. They're like, where can I use these? And they're trying to give them to everything and everybody that they know that they love because they're so effective. So maybe you can just go over that real quick, how you would dose this for kids and maybe even pets.
Sure. So kids over the age of 1, you would do pretty much the same dose of everything. My kids, fortunately, they don't have any issues that they're specifically dealing with, just to maintain health and try to improve the diversity of the microbiome in light of everything they're exposed to. So what they do is they take 1 megaspore a day, and they are 5 and 8 years old. And they've been doing this with the megaspore since they were, 4 or 5 months old. But they take 1 megaspore a day. I open it up and mix it into something, typically a yogurt or something, and then I make them a half a scoop or so of the mega prebiotic with about a half a scoop of the mega mucosa, and in a single drink, and then they kind of drink that over a couple of meals. You don't have to, take it all down at once, but that's great for kid anywhere from 1 to 12 years of age. After 12, you can go full adult dose and everything. But if my kids are sick, if they happen to pick up a cold or a flu or a virus of some sort, or we're traveling, I take them overseas with me quite a bit. If they're traveling and the body's undergoing stress, I bump up their megaspore dose to 2 or even 3 caps a day and give them the full scoop of mega mucosa and the full scoop of prebiotics. So there's no issue with kids with regards to that. Now with pets, you can do 1 to 2 caps of megaspore, just opening it up and sprinkling it on the food. I have not seen much data on pets with the prebiotic, so we're just not sure what type of bacteria would feed within pets. So I don't use the prebiotic with my pets, but you can use the mega mucosa with pets, especially ones that have inflammatory conditions, dermatitis, allergies, those types of issues. The immunoglobulins, the flavobiotics, amino acids are all perfectly fine for pets.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I would say, depending on the size of the dog, right, just kind of play with that. Start off slow and see how it works. And I've heard very good stories with pets in that regard. So it's very, very safe for pets of all kinds. At least dogs and cats that I've had experience hearing stories from. And just some tips from my point of view. The way I do it, I take the 2 Megaspore every day, typically in the morning, just because it's easy for me to wake up and use that as part of my morning routine. I use them basically every 24 hours. The Mega Pre and the Mega Mucosa, they're powders and they taste fantastic. So I actually add them to smoothies. Usually things like wild blueberries, some spirulina, or some sort of algae-based chlorella or something to that effect. What else do I add? I add those 2 products. I like a little bit of mushroom powder. A few things like that, and they taste great. You can also just drink them in water by themselves. Just put them in some sort of water bottle or whatever, shake it up, and it's good. It actually tastes really, really good. And the other thing I wanted you to clarify too, typically when you go look for these products elsewhere, maybe on Amazon or around the internet, you don't really find these a lot for commercial sale to the public directly. We aren't a practitioner company. So I just wanted you to clarify why you're sort of able to do that, and why we're working with you in this regard, and why you actually exclusively sell to physicians and people like us.
Yeah, that's really important. So we've always believed that people should be getting their products through practitioners, because the problem is, and the truth is, there's a lot of nonsense out there in the supplement world, right? And people are spending their hard-earned dollars, and they are looking for solutions, and they're led astray in many cases because there's so much nonsense out there in the supplement world. We wanted to work through doctors and practitioners because you guys have the background and the knowledge and understanding to vet these products a little bit better. The science, makes more sense to you, and the things that we can talk to practitioners and doctors about aren't things that you can say in a 30-second ad or in a label or something like that to convince or educate a consumer. So because of that vetting process, that screening capability, we wanted to bring the highest quality and most effective products through that practitioner database. Now, as Jason mentioned, we sell basically exclusively through doctors and practitioners. And we made this available through the Longevity Group and with you guys because we've got a long-standing relationship where you guys are so dedicated to the educational process. You guys are really big on content and putting out really important, life-changing information out there. And so we wanted to be a part of that and provide the tools or solutions to a lot of those dysfunctions. So, we were excited to work with you guys from day one, and we think it's a really important conduit for people to be able to get easier access to the products.
Well, we really appreciate that. And obviously for our audience, we're trying to get the best deals possible, because part of it is because we're not here to just throw supplements at you. right? Hopefully by watching the docuseries, you see that we are a lifestyle company, and we, like Quran, believe that combining a lifestyle and smart supplementation is really the way to go. And, and from our standpoint with longevity and the people that we spoke with in Ikaria and Okinawa, if you were living like they did 50 years ago, you wouldn't need these products. You just wouldn't. That's just the reality of the situation. But because we're in the US, because we have glyphosate everywhere, because we have heavy metals and toxins everywhere, we really can't avoid this stuff, even no matter how well you eat, even if you're eating organic or even growing your own food. This stuff just gets into our water supplies. It gets into our products. It's just everywhere. So this is why when it comes to the microbiota populations and rebuilding the gut, it is a critical part. Unfortunately, we really do need to do some of this stuff, even if we're healthy. It's something that I do consistently is take these products, just like you mentioned, Karan, because I just know what's out there. And no matter how well I do, this is playing a pretty important role. And so I just wanted to, we're running a little long here. I wanted to just give people a few basic tips on how they can use these with their lifestyle and some lifestyle components to bring in. Because when you combine the two, that's when you really, really get amazing effects. You can use these products on your own if you're really, really busy, if you're traveling like Karan, if you have this crazy lifestyle, you can bring these in on your own and they will make a big difference in your life. I've seen it too many times. But if you're able to make some changes on top of that, that's really where you're going to get huge, huge shifts. So things like intermittent fasting or eating in a smaller window of time, maybe from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. or something like that, or 5 p.m., and giving your gut an opportunity to just relax and not digest food and rebuild those populations. If you're able to work in a little bit longer fasting periods, maybe a day or 2 or 3, this can be, and the longer you go, I would say work with a practitioner and be really smart about it. But that can be a really, really good way to reset the gut and bring in some of these things on top of that. And you're just going to get amazing effects. I will say eating lots of organic fruits and vegetables, either raw or slightly cooked or steamed and this type of thing, so that they are really easy to digest. Raw foods, especially raw vegetables, can be very hard to digest. We don't digest cellulose very well. So breaking these things up with a little bit of heat can be very, very beneficial. In Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, you see the same things. So making the digestive process really, really easy, chewing your food really, really thoroughly, eating in a quiet setting, all these things can really, really be beneficial in terms of reducing the inflammation in the gut and feeding the healthy populations, along with some of these supplements that you can bring in. Getting good sleep, really, really critical. So really, if you look at what we teach in the documentary film series, these are the things that are actually going to be beneficial to improving gut function. But I find personally that slowing things down and eating in a smaller window and getting good sleep, those are kind of the 3 top things that I find when it comes to restoring gut function and bringing these things in on top of it. You really, really get amazing effects. And this is how we reset all the mitochondrial issues, all of the gut issues, all the systemic inflammation, all the immune system challenges. They're all working through the same mechanism, which is the gut and the immune system and the mitochondrial function. And this is what sort of regulates gene expression across the board. And the body's always going to be responsive to your environment. So if we can change the environment, include some of these amazing gut restoration supplements and protocols, really, really effective. So Joe, just tell people again real quick, kind of the deal that you mentioned, and then we'll kind of close it out.
Sure, good stuff. Again, you could take a look at the individual bottles below. They're $55 each. If you choose the Mega 3-pack, which is the Megaspore, the Mega Prebiotic, and the Mega Mucosa, you're saving 10%, or a little over $16 per order. And then if you choose auto ship, which is what the majority of people do, for obvious reasons, you're saving 15% on each of those orders, and that's about a $25 savings on that. So it's a pretty significant savings. Again, it's because of our relationship with Karan and Microbiome Labs, which we're super grateful for, and being able to pass that deal onto our tribe really is, we're really grateful for that.
And I think it's the lowest retail price that you're going to find out there.
Yeah.
There may be a couple people that may match it, but there's not going to be anybody that beats that. So
yeah, absolutely. So good stuff. Yeah. So all the info is right below this video. Super simple. So if anyone has any questions, you could find us in our Facebook group, or shoot me an email. Reply to one of the emails that I typically send out. So we're here to support everyone, and really grateful for Karan for an amazing presentation. Jason, thanks.
Thank you.
Anything else to add?
Thank you so much, Karan.
Yeah, thank you guys. We'll do it again, I'm sure.
All right.
Of course. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.